Good afternoon. And welcome on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Cornwall Historical Society. We appreciate your taking your time and leaving the World Cup behind to come out this afternoon to our program. First, a couple of logistical details, as usual. Thank you, first of all, for your willingness to change location for this particular event. Those of you who are regular attenders know that we always do our curators talk at the Historical Society building. However, past audiences have been so large that we felt it just was not appropriate or convenient to try to do it there. So, what we're going to do, since Raechel really needs to talk about her work, where she works, we're going to ask you to join us for a traveler and en route, whatever, migration from here to the Historical Society after the talk for refreshments, and then you can see what it was that she was talking about. At any rate, thank you. If you want food, you gotta walk. So here we are. Let's see. Second, the food, by the way, I need to mention this because it is very generous. Matthew's 1812 House does provide the food today for our refreshments, and I assure you it will be worth the walk. Second, please sign the guest book. Many of you have. One of our sponsors, the Connecticut Humanities, likes to know how many people take advantage of our programs and our exhibit, and it's important, so I appreciate those of you who will do that. Also, add your email address. We do send out emails of coming events, and they can serve as reminders. Help yourself as you leave, if you wish, to one of these brochures that Raechel provided. Inside is a map of the 6 cemeteries in Cornwall and a list of the approximately 60 Civil War veterans who are buried in them, and it lists each one in each cemetery for your interest. There are also 2014 calendars for sale at a reduced price, since we are partly through the year, but there are some good photographs from the exhibit that you might find interesting. And finally, I call your attention, if you haven't already noticed him, to a member of Company F, 14th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, a group which will, in fact, be presenting a Civil War reenactment on the Cornwall Green in 2 weeks, Saturday, July 26th, 10 to 3. You will receive a more detailed email if you are on our list, so consider this a teaser. Now to the business at hand. When Raechel Guest, our curator, suggested Cornwall and the Civil War for her 3rd exhibit with us, some asked why. This small village in the northwest corner of Connecticut saw no battles fought here, or even near here, no hospital established for the wounded, no treaty signed, no prisons for the captured, no army sweeping through. Well, the first response was, of course, that Major General John Sedgwick, Uncle Johnny to his men, the highest-ranking Union soldier who, to be killed in the war, was a Cornwall native, and his house still stands. But the second response, vividly, carefully, and starkly presented by Raechel, is that a town of 1,952 people suffered the loss in the field and hospital of 52 boys and men who never returned to their hometown. What Raechel has also documented, and which is equally, I think, interesting, is the effect of the war experience on those who did not return, or who did return, sorry. So you know the effect of those. It's been a long week. It should not be surprising that Raechel had to omit many stories from her presentation, and this is our chance to hear a few of them, and the process she followed in putting the exhibit together. As I mentioned earlier, this is Raechel's 3rd exhibit in Cornwall. It continues to show how fortunate Cornwall is to have her here. The exhibit has already received high praise from those in the business, and I urge you to take some time today or another day to peruse the exhibit carefully. In the meantime, I present Raechel Guest, Executive Director and Curator of the Cornwall Historical Society, to talk about Cornwall and the Civil War.
Thank you all for coming. Get used to this in a minute. When we decided to present an exhibit on the Civil War, it seemed like an easy, obvious choice to make. 2014 is the 150th anniversary of the death of Major General John Sedgwick in the center here. And Cornwall has traditionally commemorated the Civil War during such anniversary years. In fact, the Historical Society began 50 years ago with the observance of the 100th anniversary of Sedgwick's death. And in fact, when I proposed this exhibit, I spent the better part of a year saying, no, it's not the Sedgwick exhibit, it's the Civil War exhibit. I knew from the beginning that the exhibit would not be just about Sedgwick. He is the best-known Cornwall soldier, but I knew instinctively that there were many more stories to tell. As it turns out, there are close to 200 stories to tell, which is more than you can fit into one exhibit, which is why there will be a publication coming out later this year, which will have all of that research that is way too much for an exhibit, but I think is of a lot of interest to a lot of people. The one thing I didn't know is that this was going to be the most difficult exhibit I've ever worked on, mostly because it was an incredibly painful, depressing exhibit to work on. Story after story that have no happy endings, which for a few months this past winter made it a tough work to keep going through it. So, starting, let's see, there we go. This is an image most of you have probably not seen, even though you all know this person. This is John Sedgwick, way back around 1847 in his youth, before he got the beard. It's a very rarely seen image of him, published in a book reprinting his early letters. Sedgwick was career Army. He started with his graduation from West Point in 1837 and stayed in the Army his entire life. During the decades leading up to the Civil War, the U.S. military and Sedgwick spent most of their time suppressing and eradicating Native Americans. This is one of those parts of history that doesn't really get told much in the schools. Sedgwick's first military engagement was in the Second Seminole War in Florida, followed by the Cherokee Trail of Tears and the Mexican War. During the 1850s, Sedgwick was stationed in Colorado Territory, leading expeditions against the Kiowa and Comanche tribes. All of these different military actions all had the same goal, and this is what was happening in the United States. The United States needed to secure land for its settlers. And as I said, this is something that gets downplayed in the schools or is told under the glorious banner of westward expansion. And westward expansion happened because the military made sure that any Native American that wasn't welcoming to the settlers was dealt with very harshly. By the end of the 1850s, Sedgwick was fed up with the military and with his mission. He'd had enough. He wrote to his sister that the U.S. citizens he was protecting in the Colorado Territory were worse, far worse than the native tribes, and that he suspected that at least half of the murders blamed on Native Americans were, in fact, being committed by the gold miners and other settlers in the plains. In 1860, Sedgwick was planning to apply for a one-year leave of absence, followed by retirement. He was ready to come back home to Cornwall Hollow. And then the South started talking about secession during the presidential campaign of 1860, and as Sedgwick watched the political drama play out, he realized that he was going to have to wait for his retirement. Anyone know who that is?
Stewart.
Jeb Stuart. What's he doing here? Relationships are an important part of the Civil War story. And it is very important to remember that the military leaders on both sides of the conflict previously served in the Army together. Many of them, in fact, graduated from West Point together. This is not strictly, a North versus South. This is a war fought by people who had fought side by side for many, many years. The example of Sedgwick and Jeb Stuart is a very good example of this. They served together in Colorado during the years leading up to the war and shared a great admiration for one another. Sedgwick is said to have called Stuart, quote, the best cavalry officer that was ever foaled in the United States. They both read the news as it arrived in 1860 and 1861, sitting out there at Fort Wise, out in Colorado, and they had to choose. So you imagine this. You've got a fort full of career military soldiers reading the news from home, reading that the South is seceding, reading that war is beginning, and they have to choose sides and go separate ways. Stuart chose his home state, and Sedgwick chose to remain in the U.S. military. Upon hearing of Sedgwick's death, Stuart said he would have, quote, gladly shared his blanket and last crust of bread with him, as he was one of the best friends I had in the old army. So, I imagine that everyone here is familiar with the Sedgwick Memorial in Cornwall. How many of you know where this is? Have seen this? Anyone? Anyone?
West Point?
Hartford. This is on the Capitol building in Hartford. It was installed in 1929, and he stands there on the second story of the Capitol building along with famous governors and other important people in Connecticut's history. Here he is side by side with how he was depicted in 1864. I really was very amused when I went over to Hartford and saw the statue on the Capitol building and realized just how fanciful it really is. It's a 1920s romanticized version of what a Civil War general ought to look like. With his, he's got his thigh boots, he's got his big hat, he's got these huge gloves, very skin-tight jacket on there, made out of some fabric that didn't exist in the 1860s. When you look at the 1864 image of Sedgwick, his beard is very scraggly and unkempt. He always, in every image I've seen, wore his pants over his boots, and no gloves. In fact, I haven't really seen any pictures of him with gloves either. So the artist of the Sedgwick statue on the Capitol was using his imagination when he designed this. You'll be able to see this much better in the exhibit itself. So part of the process for creating an exhibit is to go through what we have in our collections at the Historical Society. Going through the objects that we have and going through the documents that we have. So while I was sorting through our archives in search of Civil War material, I uncovered a box that was stuffed full of what turned out to be maps. And these maps, according to the notation on the box, were part of the Sedgwick collection. And the maps clearly all had something to do with the Civil War. They were all maps of southern areas. And at first, I really wasn't sure what I was looking at. I'm not an expert in historic military maps. I don't think I've actually even handled historic military maps before this. And it took me a little while to realize that these were 150-year-old maps that had been barely touched in 150 years. This is a detail of that same map where you can see, and you can see it better on the actual map in the exhibit, places where it has been annotated. General Lee's headquarters is indicated, Jackson's headquarters, Early's division, and then over on the left, again, you'll see it better on the actual map, you can see a place where there was something written that has been scratched out and removed. So this is an actual field map. This is a map that was actively used in the Civil War and is one of, as I said, several that are on view in the exhibit. Music was also something that I found in our archives. This sheet of music was published in 1862. The title of the song is "We Will Not Retreat Anymore," which is, you can look at that a little sarcastically, I suppose. In 1862, the Union Army wasn't doing that well, and so the "We Will Not Retreat Anymore" as a refrain was something that was, you know, okay, let's get our act together. By itself, it is an interesting piece of Civil War history. It's not a terribly well-known song, but it is part of the Civil War. But the part that makes it very exciting for me is that it is inscribed on the top and on the bottom, and those inscriptions tell us that this sheet of music was sent to Minor Rogers in Cornwall from William Cogswell, who was in Washington, D.C. And at the time, Cogswell was a sergeant with the 19th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. He added "right soon" to the top of the sheet of the music. This is part of that story of relationships, that the Cornwall troops who left town, who went places that without the war they probably never would have visited, are keeping close connections to their friends and their family at home. And even at camp, they're staying close to one another because they're all signing up into the same companies. They are going in groups to a large degree. So you'll have 5, a dozen, even 20 or more Cornwall soldiers who are all together for most of the war. William Cogswell, the soldier who sent that sheet of music back to his friend in Cornwall, was the first Native American in Connecticut to enlist in the war. He was a member of the Schaghticoke tribe, and he originally attempted to enlist at Winstead when the war first started. He did enlist at Winstead and was sworn into service, but then his fellow white soldiers demanded that he be kicked out on the grounds solely that he was not white. They did not want to serve with him. His enlistment was canceled, and his name was erased from the muster rolls. On June 22nd, 1861, he tried again to enlist, this time here in Cornwall, where he had spent his whole life, where he was very much a part of the town's community. He was, in fact, known as the town's fastest runner at any race held at the local fairs. And in fact, if there was a race being held at a fair and Cogswell showed up, they pretty much canceled the race because they knew he would win. He had no difficulty joining a regiment here in Cornwall because this was his hometown and this was his community and these were his friends. He enlisted as a sergeant with Company I of the 5th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. He was taken prisoner briefly by the Confederates, paroled and discharged in 1862, came home for 2 months, and then re-enlisted. This time he enlisted with Company B of the 19th Infantry, which, for those of you who keep track of these things, was later the 2nd Heavies, the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. William Cogswell's younger brother, Newton, joined him in Company B a few months later. The brothers served side by side. When Newton was wounded in the arm at the Battle of Cold Harbor, William was there to stay by his side and comfort him. William Cogswell was greatly admired by his fellow soldiers and commanding officers for his endurance and his optimism. He was promoted to 2nd lieutenant on March 5th, 1864. Months later, in September, he was wounded in the leg at the Battle of Winchester. Remembering that he was known for being the fastest runner in town, his leg was amputated. And he died weeks later from complications related to the amputation. He was given a hero's burial in the North Cornwall Cemetery. His brother Newton, you could argue that his brother Newton didn't fare as well. Newton survived the war physically, but everything indicates that he suffered from PTSD in an era when people did not understand the impact of the trauma of war. Newton was okay for a while. He married, but eventually his wife left him and demanded a divorce, and Newton snapped. He shot at her 5 times, hit her in the head twice. She survived, but he fled to a barn and killed himself. I mean, just incredibly painful painful, tragic stories. If the war hadn't happened, I think his life would have gone very differently. Another source of material is on the internet. There's a website called Fold3, which provides access to military records from the National Archives, and this is one of those documents. This is a death certificate for a young Cornwall boy, really, named Henry Ford. Henry was 16 years old when he enlisted in 1861. His older brother enlisted with him, and the two joined Company D of the 11th Volunteer Infantry. The Fords, perhaps not coincidentally, lived next door to Sedgwick's brother. So this may have been part of the reason why they signed up so young and so early in the war, because Sedgwick's brother is right next door. They know what's going on with Sedgwick. They may have more information and more excitement for patriotism than the average person. Henry Ford, who was 16 years old, never saw action. He contracted typhoid fever en route to Virginia, and he died on shipboard 3 months after he enlisted and was buried at sea the next day. His brother William was with him on shipboard, so he was there when Henry died and when he was buried at sea. William died as well 2 years later from an infection. We have a couple of souvenirs in our collection, if you want to call them that. This beam was brought back or sent back by a soldier. We don't know who at this point. And the beam has an Old Historical Society label on it, which reads, "Beam from Old Flour Mill at Cedar Creek, Virginia, burned by General Sheridan during his Valley Raid, October 1864. There were numerous Cornwall soldiers who participated in that Valley campaign, dozens of them. So it is a little difficult to try to figure out who was a soldier who saved this beam and sent it back. Another very unhappy story, as most of these are. Edward Gold. Edward Gold was the nephew of the wealthiest man in Cornwall, Seth Pierce. Gold grew up right here in this part of Cornwall. His mother died when he was a boy. His father moved away and started a new family and left Edward with his uncle Seth to raise him as part of his family. Edward's life was going very well before the war. He operated several mills. He was elected to the state legislature in 1858, and he had everything going extremely well. He was one of the first men in Cornwall to enlist in the Army, beginning as a lieutenant and quickly rising to the rank of captain with Company G of the 2nd Heavy Artillery. Things started going wrong, but again, in this era, they did not recognize warning signs that today, to us, would be obvious. It was said that Edward Gold never slept throughout the duration of his service. They saw that as a sign of his strength. We know better now. The night before the Battle of Cedar Creek, he was reported to have wandered around camp with what they called a vague presentiment of danger. Another warning sign, something that again we would see as the stress taking a huge, huge toll on his mental health. After the war, he attempted to return to normal life. He came back to Cornwall, lived with his uncle, managed a farm and a sawmill. He actually, with his uncle, oversaw the planting of all of the elm trees along Pine Street. If you recall those beautiful old elms. By 1890, he was suffering from debilitating bouts of mental instability. In May of 1890, he was at Arkansas looking into potential for real estate investments in the newly opened Oklahoma Territory, which again ties us back to that early career of Sedgwick, where it's all about taking land for settlement. Gold's cousin invited him to come see this opportunity. We have a fragment of a letter that Gold wrote to someone while he was in Arkansas. Everything in the letter seems normal. Everything about his mental capacity seems fine. Nothing seems to be wrong. But a few months later, on September 10th, he showed up at a small town in Ohio and wandered aimlessly around that town's main street. And the town officials determined that he was insane from his conduct and from his talk. So something, and we don't know what, something happened in just a few short months. He eventually found his way home and was found dead in his former mill in 1895. He was buried in a Cornwall cemetery alongside his uncle with a monument inscribed, "A true patriot, a brave soldier." Joseph Payne was, from what I can tell, a very well-loved young man in Cornwall. He had a lot of friends. A lot of people thought very highly of him. He enlisted with the 2nd Heavy Artillery in 1862. He was quartermaster for Company G, and he was killed in action at the Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864. The Battle of Cold Harbor was just unbelievably devastating. Wade Rawls will be talking about it in August. One of the most profound stories from that for me, the first, of course, Joseph Payne, Edward Gould, and one of the things I think that contributes to Edward Gould's difficulties is that he, as captain, had to follow up with all of the pension applications for the widows and the orphans and the mothers of those who died. And Gould, years later, had to recount, yes, I saw Payne die, I saw him get shot, and I saw him fall. One of the more truly emotional stories from Cold Harbor were 2 young corporals, George Page and Charles Reed, young Cornwall men who would have known each other most of their lives, who were very close friends. They were about 20 years old, 24 years old. They were both wounded, fatally wounded during the battle, and they saw each other across the field and crawled towards one another in the midst of the battle as they were dying. And their bodies were found locked in each other's embrace. And that story just, that's one of the most incredible and painful stories that always brings tears to my eyes, because just to imagine these 2 young men in the middle of battle, wounded, bleeding, comforting each other in their final moments is just incredibly powerful. Joseph Payne, in the photo here, wrote frequently to his sister, Charlotte, nicknamed Lottie, back home in Cornwall. We have several of his letters. In happier days, before he started entering into battles, Payne wrote, "The boys from Cornwall are all well," and discussed a box of food and other items from home that Charlotte was preparing to send to him, requesting pie, and encouraging her to send, quote, "a good-sized box, for it don't cost much more than a small one." Fearing the worst for himself, Payne prepared a final letter. This is something a lot of soldiers did, and we have his final letter that he sent to his sister, and he arranged for it to be sent in the event of his death. So he actually wrote in the letter, "Sister Lottie, do not be at your wit's end wondering who this comes from, but receive it as the words of your now sainted brother Joseph. From one who loves thee with thoughts too dear to tell, let us recognize each other in heaven." The rest of the letter was a poem which he copied from a source that I have not been able to find yet. It is a poem that has not yet been digitized. It is not on the internet, and he didn't say where he got it from. Part of it, "Oh, think of me not as afar, when you meet where the oft bereft circle sits closer around. Look not with despondence on one vacant seat, nor think of me there as beneath the cold ground. From my home in the mansions of glory above, I may visit you often in those circles of love." We know from other letters written by other soldiers that they spent a lot of time worrying about their families and what was going to happen if they died, and how to make sure things that were important to them were returned to their families, and how to make sure their families were informed. Because there were cases where the mother of the soldier or the wife of the soldier wouldn't know for months what had happened. This is another item from our archives. This is a pair of pages from a record book kept by the South Cornwall Ladies Charitable Society, which this is where we are now, has at times been called South Cornwall. The society formed years before the war, but they focused their efforts on raising money during the war, on the war effort, making bedding, clothing, and other goods for soldiers. Wives and widows of soldiers were active participants with the society, as well as quite a few single young women. And the record book is also on view in the exhibit, and it's just this great documentation of what was happening on the home front. Now, while we have this record of supporting the soldiers on the home front, we also know from letters and newspaper accounts that not everyone in Cornwall supported the war. We know that there was, when the war first started, there was somebody who tried to fly a Southern flag in town. That was quickly torn down. One of the ministers, whose letters are up in Hartford at the Connecticut Historical Society, wrote to his brother frequently about the challenges of a congregation that includes family members of soldiers and family members of Confederate soldiers, because apparently there were a few young men from Cornwall who went south. And there were people who simply were Southern supporters. They supported the Southern cause. So as minister, Stephen Fenn had a delicate task of balancing the needs of these conflicting parishioners. There were a number of Cornwall soldiers who wound up prisoners of war. William Cogswell, as I mentioned before. This is the Florence Stockade prison camp, which was modeled after the better-known Andersonville. By some accounts, Florence Stockade was much worse than Andersonville. And it was located in Florence, South Carolina, held about 18,000 Union soldiers as prisoners of war, of whom more than 2,800 died. One of those was a man from Cornwall named Tracy Bristol, who served with the 5th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. He was captured during Sherman's March to the Sea, sent to the Florence Stockade prison camp, and died there in 1865. We have, let's see, I believe at least two soldiers from Cornwall who were at Andersonville. Pierre, probably Guy, who was the great-grandson of Revolutionary War General Heman Swift. He spent 9 months at Andersonville. Martin Hull, Pierre survived Andersonville. Martin Hull did not survive Andersonville. He was there for 4 months before he died of disease and malnutrition. He's buried at Andersonville, but there's a marker to his memory at Cornwall Hollow. Josiah Corbin. Josiah Corbin is one of the sort of person that historians love, put it that way. Solely because almost all of the letters he wrote to his wife and his children are accessible at the Connecticut Historical Society. A copy of his diary from his final year in the war was actually just sent to us by a Historical Society of Virginia that has a copy of it. So we have that incredible document. And that Historical Society of Virginia also has this photograph of him. So it is one of those things that is great because so much of the story is told and you have so many different components of it. Josiah Corbin was a Cornwall farmer. When the war started, he was married and had 3 children. He enlisted with Company G of the 19th, which was later the 2nd Heavy Artillery. And judging from the letters he wrote, he was mostly motivated to enlist out of patriotism. He was also, judging from his letters, a very devout Christian, very much in favor of temperance. He occasionally wrote disparagingly about people who drank too much at camp. He also was very upset by all of the swearing that went on at camp. So it was a little bit of an adjustment to him. He was very homesick the first few months. It was a real hardship for him to be separated from his family, but he really felt that this was his duty and his obligation. He also was taken prisoner by Confederate troops, and when they finally released him back to the Union, he was suffering from boils, scurvy, and malnutrition. He had actually, from the quick glance I had at his diary the other day, it arrived Friday, to a quick glance, he actually was suffering from dysentery before he was captured. It had dragged on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and you know, the Army didn't care. If you could march, you could march. So when he was released from the Confederates, he spent a month or so in a military hospital and finally received a disability discharge because he simply could not recover from the physical toll on his body. Cornwall also had a number of African American troops, soldiers. This is the masthead from a newspaper published at a camp in Louisiana for the African American troops during the Civil War. And Jeremiah May, who was from Cornwall, was stationed at that camp when this was printed, so this is something he probably would have read. I don't have any photos of Jeremiah, unfortunately, just documents from that Fold 3 website I mentioned, which are his enlistment papers. Jeremiah May was born in New York and moved to Sharon in the 1850s. And then in 1859 got married and moved to Cornwall in 1860 and worked as a day laborer. Jeremiah May did not willingly enlist. On July 23rd, 1863, he was drafted. Now, when he was drafted, Connecticut did not have a regiment for anyone who wasn't white. Since he was African American, Connecticut shipped him over to Rhode Island because Rhode Island did have a black regiment. So you have to imagine this. Here he is. He's in Cornwall. He's been married for a couple of years. He's started a family. He's, life is moving along. And all of a sudden, he's drafted. He has to leave this area. He has to go to Rhode Island, and then he gets shipped south. He was assigned to the 14th Regiment Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, was immediately promoted to corporal, and served with the regiment until October 1865, when he mustered out at New Orleans and returned home. And then there's this little brochure coming out of Cornwall. This is written by Theodore Gold. This is a plan for, the short version is, a plan for the orphan children of the war. There were approximately 5,354 men from Connecticut, statewide, who were killed during the war. They left behind widows and children, so many children that it was seen as a genuine problem. So Theodore Gold, who was active at a state level, put forth a proposal for the state to take care of those orphans. The General Assembly chartered the Connecticut Soldiers' Orphans Home in May of 1864 and opened 2 years later in Mansfield. Gold served as secretary of the home during its 9 years of operation. More than 200 Civil War orphans were given a home and an education there. This was the building that the orphanage opened up in on a 50-acre farm. The building actually had been constructed with a plan to turn it into a boys' school, but things didn't go well and it became this orphanage. In 1881, after all the orphans had grown up and left the orphanage, It reopened as the store's agricultural school, which is better known today as the University of Connecticut. And Theodore Gold was a trustee of that school for 20 years. And here's the best little-known tidbit. Theodore Gold's plan was to have the orphanage open here in Cornwall. So if that plan had gone through, Yukon would be Yukon Cornwall. Imagine, it would be a little different here right now if it had gone that way. So those are a few of the highlights. Sampling, I think a representative sampling of some of the documents and the artifacts and the stories. There's quite a lot more in the exhibit. And so I hope you'll all make the long march down Pine Street to join us for refreshments there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I cannot believe that every one of us, each one of us, didn't learn something today that we didn't know before about this tragic piece of our United States history. And I want to thank Walter, or Warren rather, for standing back there in this heat, in his uniform, just as a suggestion of what these boys went through. I repeat Rachel's invitation. I think we're all ready for something cold and liquid. So come join us over at 7 Pine. Thanks again for coming.